listeners, but bear with us, listeners. We have to face up to it because it's your tax dollars, it's your U.S. weapons, it's the backing of the United States with the Security Council veto of any resolution designed to protect the safety and human rights of Palestinian people. And of course, the full-throated support of the Netanyahu regime, regardless of what is stated about minimizing civilian casualties by Secretary of State Blinken or President Biden. It's the shipment of weapons and cover, diplomatic and political, that is what Netanyahu wants and gets. The rest is just deceptive rhetoric. You've lost almost 100 members of your family in Gaza since October 7th.
That's correct.
I'd like you to describe the whole scene as you know it so well.
So I apologize. It's a little bit difficult to go through, but the last 4 months have been an absolute nightmare for our family. We have a large family. My mother's side of the family is from the town of Khan Yunis, which is the southern Gaza Strip, and my father's side of the family is from Gaza City. We have hundreds and hundreds of family members. And I grew up there. Basically, over the past 4 months, my routine has been basically every morning finding out who's died, who's survived, who's suffering, who needs help. And it's been a constant daily thing starting from October. Just to recount a couple of stories. So on October 25th, we got word from Khan Yunis, one of my cousins, Jamal al-Farra, his son, Tawfiq al-Farra, who's a physician, his wife, who was pregnant, Dana, two of their beautiful daughters, Reem and Hada, Jamal's brother, Assam, and his wife, Samad, and their daughters, Rusul, Tuqa, and Nadian. 3 generations of one family, multiple siblings, grandfather, grandkids. Every one of them were all killed, 10 people. Tuqa, one of the children who was in her early 20s, her wedding day was the day she was killed. They all came from very modest means. They grew up just a couple of houses down from where I was raised. And 3 of them actually had built their family homes with their own hands because they were of modest means, and the whole multi-level house got destroyed. This entire family got erased off the civil registry, essentially, 3 generations. Then just literally another couple days later, in late October, my cousins Hatem and Aziz al-Farra, also from Khan Yunis, from my mom's al-Farra side of the family, they lived 20 yards from where I grew up, from my grandparents' home in Khan Yunis. And they were killed along with 14 members of their family, 7 of their children. Aziz was a pharmacist. His brother Hatem, a community figure who literally would do anything to help anybody in Khan Yunis. He was always around to help. Whoever needed help, he would help. The day before, Hatem had actually gone to my uncle, Rashid, and asked him if he could house 5 families who were made homeless by the Israeli missile strikes in my grandparents' home. And of course, my uncle and I said, of course, please put them in our home. And that was what he was doing. That was the day before he got killed. There was one child, from this whole 16 people of this side of the family that survived, a little kid, Hamza. And this child survived with an amputation, woke up in the hospital to find out his father, his uncle, all of his siblings, his grandfather, everybody had died. And then he himself died a day later, just because the situation in the hospital was so terrible. They didn't have the resources to keep him alive. Then a couple days after that, my father's side of the family, who was in Gaza City, started to hit them too. And so November 2nd, my first cousin Hani and my first cousin Huda and Wafat, all siblings, they all got killed, along with my cousin Hani's Croatian wife Vera and my aunt, their mother. Huda and Wafat were teachers. Hani was an interior designer. The tragic part is not just the brutality of it. It was a missile strike that hit them when they were all in the hallway, basically together. And it was very clear they were targeted at a time when they were all together, because the missile strike happened as soon as they all walked into a corridor together. My cousin Hani initially survived with what I know as a physician as quite a minor leg injury. And then the very next day, he bled to death because he had no access to any functional medical facilities. Every hospital near them in northern Gaza had been destroyed. Hani's brother, Wa'il, my other cousin, survived initially, and then he had to deal with a nightmare of watching his mother, seeing his mother buried from the neck up in the rubble, dead. And then he saw his sister Wafat, who he described to me in gruesome detail. He had to see her shredded into multiple pieces from the Israeli bombing. My other cousin had to bury all these family members in a makeshift grave because they couldn't even reach a grave site. And so he had to bury them near his house, wherever he could. And since that time, my cousin, the one who survived, He's sending me messages telling me, he goes, 24 hours at a time with no food, no water. That's just routine for him. Even after that, a lot of my family at that point, by November, were having to flee because of lack of water, because of flyers that were being dropped on them by the Israeli military, saying that if they do not move, they will be considered terrorists and will be targeted as such. And they even sent me pictures of these kinds of flyers that they received. So they all moved and to supposed safe areas. And then that wasn't enough. Samar al-Farra, one of my cousins, then died in a refugee camp in a supposed safe area in Rafah, right on the same day that she had completed her doctorate for her PhD. We were about to congratulate her. Many of them then started dying from poor medical care and inability to access medical care. My cousin Abdulrahim al-Farra died because he could not reach a functional hospital after he was injured from the Israeli military strikes. Then 4 of my family members on my Al-Farra side of the family, ironically, were killed while they were in their car, literally going to the Gaza European Hospital for shelter, and they were targeted and killed in their car as they were about to head to the hospital for shelter. A few weeks ago, a cousin of mine, Sabri al-Farra, was killed with 7 of his sons. And then most recently, just in late January, another member of my family, a baby, 20 days old, Sabir al-Farra, he died from hypothermia, from cold weather. He was 20 days old. And this is after 9 of his siblings had been killed and his father had been killed in a Israeli military strike in late December. So he was the only one other than his mother who had survived, and then he died from hypothermia, the baby. There's many, many more stories like this. I mean, it's 100 family members. It's hard to describe them all, but these are just the ones that kind of give your listeners an idea. And we're not special. We're no different than any other family in Gaza. Every single family you talk about, every large family like ours has experienced what we have.
Dr. Haddad, anybody who thinks that this all started October 7th doesn't know the history of the terror that has been inflicted on the Palestinian people. Give us an idea of what happened in 2014, 2009, and when you were living in Gaza, about what life was like, and also in the West Bank.
Yeah, so my family and I, we've been experiencing violence for our whole lives. It stretches even before I was born. My grandmother was the head of the United Nations schools in the Gaza Strip in the late 60s and early 70s after the occupation of the Gaza Strip began. And she would get beaten for telling her students, educating her students on where her parents were from. That was her crime. Educating her students who were asking, what's Haifa like? What's Jaffa like? What are these towns that my parents keep telling us that we're from? Because almost everybody in Gaza is a refugee from somewhere else in what's in Israel proper currently. I grew up there from the time I was 2 months old. The stories that would happen just that I could recount, violence was just a part of life. I had cologne. My grandmother had cologne in every single room in our house. And the reason we had cologne is because we would get tear gassed randomly at various times, and we couldn't predict it. My grandmother had to have cologne around so that she could douse our faces, the children's faces, with the cologne so that the tear gas wouldn't just absolutely torture us and sting us. My grandmother, I had days where I'd wake up and there were soldiers in our kitchen, eating out of our kitchen, because they would use our balcony. We were on the 3rd floor, and they would use our balcony as a scouting area to snipe at children in the street. This was routine. We just had to accept it. That's just part of occupation. You can't do anything about soldiers going into your home. We had a beautiful orchard between Khan Yunis and Gaza. I used to play there every summer, and it got completely and utterly destroyed by Israeli tanks. Every tree was uprooted, turned essentially into a desert. We had hundreds of olive trees and fruit trees, and it was all destroyed, again, for no good reason. It was an orchard that we survived with, we ate from, we played in. That's all it was. That's just life under occupation. I played chess in the street all the time with my cousins because we lived in a packed neighborhood. When I was 13 years old, in around 1987, soldiers came up to the beginning of the street and just saw a couple of kids playing chess, I guess, and they ran towards us. They grabbed my cousin and broke his arm. I had to run. They shot rubber bullets at me. I had to just hide in a chicken coop in my neighbor and uncle's yard to be able to, escape being arrested for just playing chess. I would go through 18 hours of checkpoints just to go from Amman and Jordan to Gaza. We wake up at 3 a.m. We wouldn't get there till about 9 p.m. at night. And this was after being strip searched and humiliated. Our clothes would be packed into baskets with 5 other children's families and then dumped on a big table. And we'd have to sort through them among 5 other families to get our clothes. This was just routine. This was just life under occupation.
How about the seizure of land and water?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, water was so incredibly rare resource that we couldn't wash our dishes, wash our clothes, and take a normal what your readers would consider an American shower type shower. We couldn't do all three the same day. It was impossible because there wasn't enough water, and that was even before the 2000s. And then once the blockade of Gaza began, it became even worse. My parents would have 4 hours of electricity a day maximum, and that was they had to do everything they could in those 4 hours. The winters were terrible because it would get cold and you didn't have ability of electricity. So electricity was rare, water was even rarer. Often people had to recycle water. 97% of the water supply in Gaza during those days was not fit for human consumption. And that's based on studies that have been done by the United Nations. That was before October 7th. 2014, during one of the previous Israeli strikes on Gaza, it was a dark time. My youngest son, Ramzi, was born, but we couldn't celebrate it because the day he was born, 67 people were killed in a neighborhood where some of my family lived in Gaza, the Shujaiya neighborhood in Gaza. And then I had 10 members of my family killed during that time on August 1st, including multiple kids, a 4-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 11-year-old who was top of his class in school, 2 8-year-olds. And the last missile strike that hit the 8-year-olds was as they were running away from the home in plain sight of anybody who could see it from an airplane. They were targeted and killed 2 8-year-olds. This is back in August 1st, well before this October time.
And what can you say about invitation by Secretary of State Blinken with Palestinian Americans very recently? Where was the invitation? Who attended? How long was Secretary Blinken going to be with you? Which led you to reject the invitation and issue a 12-page letter, which included many pictures of your dead relatives over in Gaza that we can talk about in a moment. What was the nature of this invitation, and why did you reject it?
Yeah, so the invitation was titled as a roundtable on the situation in Gaza. I'm quoting the actual email invitation. And it came from the Secretary of State. It was in the State Department. My understanding, I was not told who else was invited in the invitation, but it was sent to prominent members of the Palestinian American community, particularly those who have family in Gaza or who have a connection to Gaza. And that's what I'm aware of. In terms of, it was meant to be a small roundtable with 6 to 8 people. And I was one of the ones invited. I was told it would be around a half-hour meeting, and that, doing the math, about 8 people, that each of us would have 3 minutes to speak of what we wanted to say to Secretary of State. 3 minutes.
And you turned it down. Why?
I turned it down because what I've witnessed over the past 4 months is, I'm a physician, and as a physician, every day I have to empathize with people, and I do empathize with people. I always try to put myself in other people's shoes. And I believe actions speak louder than words. As a physician, I can't just tell my patients what they should do and not treat them. It has to be followed with action. And what I saw was 4 months of actions that were murdering my family, that were murdering the 15,000 children in Gaza who've been killed, that have murdered the 30,000 civilians who've been killed. Specific actions, lack of refusal to call for a ceasefire, vetoes in the United Nations for other countries to try to call for a ceasefire, multiple actions of transferring military equipment from our strategic military reserve to be used for this genocide, for this killing of children of my family members. And then most recently, right before the invitation, literally within 48 hours of when I got this invitation, the withdrawal of humanitarian aid, the most cruel behavior of all, the withdrawal of humanitarian aid to 2 million people who are displaced, homeless, hungry, have no access to water, minimal access to food, going through a famine, withdrawing funding humanitarian assistance for these poor people who are going through this. And that's what I witnessed. And, I'm asked to meet with Secretary Blinken, and in 3 minutes to tell him what those actions have done, what they've caused, the suffering they've caused my family, the messages I'm getting, hearing that they can't eat or drink for 24 hours, the messages I'm getting from my uncle saying that he's getting diarrhea over and over because they have to keep recycling water, and knowing that my Secretary of State was one of the people primarily responsible for their suffering and their death, and the death of this unnecessary death of civilians. And I could not bring myself, knowing that this was political grandstanding, that this was, in all likelihood, a photo op to basically say that, the administration is listening to Palestinians when actions speak louder than words. And I know that they were not doing anything from an action standpoint to actually help my family survive and end the suffering. And I couldn't bring myself as a human being, forget as a physician, couldn't bring myself to meet with somebody for a photo op as a grandstanding opportunity, knowing full well what this administration has done to cause suffering and death in my family. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And especially given 3 minutes, how am I in 3 minutes going to describe everything that's happened to my family and all my fellow Palestinians in Gaza?
And you explained this in a 12-page letter. Is the letter available for the public? If so, how can they get it?
It is. It is available for the public. It has been posted. I was asked to be able to provide it publicly, and it is available on a website. And I can certainly get everybody that address. It's on a website called Here for the Kids, and it's https:// here HERE the number 4 the kids THEKIDS .substack S as in Sam UBSTACK.com. And you can access it via that website. Last thing I just would like to ask your listeners is just treat everybody like human beings. I look at myself in the shoes of somebody, who has a hostage, who's a family member hostage, and that's no different than I can care about that. And everybody else on a side that you may not understand can also put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian who's lived under blockade and occupation and now genocide. And you can put yourself in their shoes in the same way. And I just ask people to see each other as human beings and not as people of a certain religion or ethnicity. And that's, in my opinion, the way around this. I think it's just more empathy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haddan. I hope your voice of humanity will reach larger audiences in the coming weeks.